Let me start with something that might actually be a relief to hear. Your life is not random. Now, I know sometimes it can feel that way. You have a good month and then something dips. You start making progress and then suddenly you feel like you're back where you started. Money comes in and then it completely disappears. Momentum builds and then somehow it fades. And after this happens enough times, most people begin to believe one of two things. Either life is unpredictable or they must be doing something wrong. However, what I have discovered over many years studying success principles, mindset, human behavior, and also just living long enough to observe stuff is something very different. I've noticed that what appears random on the surface is often actually patterned underneath. And once you understand that, life begins to make a lot more sense. Today, I'd like to show you why results feel random and why I believe they are not random at all. Because once you see the structure underneath your results, something powerful happens. You stop blaming yourself in the same way. You stop chasing random solutions and you begin working with the real cause instead of the visible symptom. So in this video, I want to walk you through 3 key ideas. First, why life can feel inconsistent even when it's actually just following a pattern. And second, I'll show you that I discovered how internal patterns quietly produce repeated outcomes over and over. And third, how identity organizes what feels normal for you to create and sustain that creation. And to make this practical, I want to share some stories and real examples because I've found that concepts alone are not always enough because stories help us see ourselves. Now, before we get into the framework, let me take you back to something from my own life. Many years ago, when I was working as a musician in Liverpool, England, I lived what I often describe as a classic feast or famine rhythm. Most weeks, everything felt alive. Great. The phone rang, the gigs were there, opportunities appeared all over the place. And then there were other periods when everything went quiet. Crickets. And when you live in that rhythm long enough, something starts happening in your thinking. You begin to believe life works in waves of luck. When things go well, you think, oh, this is great. However, when things slow down, you think, I guess the wave passed. And you start living like someone waiting for life to happen again. Now, at that time, I didn't yet understand paradigms the way I later came to understand them. And to be honest, I probably didn't even realize what a darn paradigm was. I didn't yet understand identity patterns. I didn't yet understand that our subconscious often recreates what feels familiar, not simply what we say we want. So, what I called randomness was actually repetition wearing different clothing. So, that insight took me years to fully appreciate because most people look at their life in isolated moments. 1 month, one deal, one argument, one opportunity, one disappointment. And when you look at life in fragments, it does look random. But when you zoom out, patterns start to appear. You notice similar reactions, similar emotional responses, similar financial cycles, similar relationship dynamics, similar stop and start patterns with motivation. The details change, but the emotional experience remains strangely familiar. That's the first clue. So let me give you the first core idea. Life feels random when we only look at outcomes instead of patterns. You see, most people only notice outcomes. They notice that the money has disappeared. They notice that their motivation has dropped. They notice that something didn't work. But they really study what happened internally before the outcome arrived. What thoughts were rehearsed? What emotional state was present? What assumptions were operating quietly in the background? What familiar reactions were triggered? Because results rarely appear out of nowhere. They usually emerge from repeated internal patterns. Let me give you a simple example. Two people face the same challenge. One interprets it as feedback. The other interprets it as proof that nothing ever works. Same event, different meaning, different response, totally different outcome. That means the event itself is not the full story. The meaning behind the event matters just as much. And when the same meaning gets repeated over time, it begins producing familiar outcomes. Now, this leads to something most people overlook because the mind loves familiarity. Not necessarily happiness, not necessarily success, but familiarity. This is an unbelievable, profound truth about human behavior. People often assume they move towards what they want, but in reality, we often move towards what feels normal. And normal doesn't necessarily mean it's good. Normal means familiar. And I believe that distinction changes how you see your life, because now, when results repeat, instead of asking, why is this happening to me? We can actually ask, what feels familiar here? And I believe that that question alone can totally shift your awareness dramatically. There were periods in my life where things began improving, but internally something still felt really tense. Externally, progress was really happening, but internally, part of me felt really cautious. Have you ever experienced that? Things start going well, and instead of fully relaxing into it, part of you braces for impact, as it were, almost waiting for the reversal. At the time, I might have said, I'm just stressed. But later, I realized what I was experiencing was unfamiliar territory. You see, in my experience, success can feel just as unfamiliar as struggle. And unfamiliar environments often create internal tension until they become normalized. So sometimes people don't lose momentum because they don't want success. They actually lose momentum because success still feels emotionally unfamiliar. And that insight changes everything, because it means inconsistency is not always about discipline. Sometimes it's about familiarity. Now let's take a second look at this framework. Your results are often the delayed expression of repeated internal patterns. So that means what you experience today may be connected to this emotional habit. This is why effort alone sometimes doesn't produce lasting change. Sure, effort can temporarily override patterns, but if the pattern underneath remains untouched, results often return to the previous baseline. It's a bit like steering a car with misaligned wheels. You know what that feels like. In fact, I've got a car that's doing that right now. You can keep correcting the direction, but the car keeps drifting until the alignment, in this case the deeper alignment, is fixed. Many people are actually living like that, trying harder, pushing more, forcing motivation, while the underlying internal alignment remains unchanged. That's totally exhausting. And it's totally unnecessary once you understand the real structure. So, what are these patterns made of? Well, they're made of things like what we call repeated interpretations, which are basically the story you keep telling yourself about what happens or how you usually explain things in your mind, and the meaning you automatically give to situations. Example might be, instead of thinking, that didn't work this time, someone might automatically think, see, things never work out for me. That's a repeated interpretation. Now, emotional habits are actually feelings your brain returns to automatically. Your emotional default, as it were, how you tend to feel most of the time. Now, let's bring this into our everyday life. Someone wants financial growth, but whenever money increases, they feel tension. They worry about losing it. They avoid looking at numbers. They spend impulsively to relieve the pressure. Does that sound familiar? From the outside, it looks like money comes and goes randomly, but underneath, there is a familiar emotional relationship with the money. Another example would be someone wants confidence, but in conversations, they assume that others are more certain. They soften their opinions. They hesitate. Again, confidence appears inconsistent. But underneath, there's a stable identity pattern there. This brings us to the deepest layer, identity. Identity is the organizing force behind behavior. If someone still sees themselves as someone who struggles, progress can feel temporary. If someone still sees themselves as someone who loses momentum, consistency feels unnatural. If someone still sees themselves as someone who must fight for everything, peace can actually feel very suspicious. And when identity organizes life that way, results appear inconsistent every time. Not because life is random, but because identity keeps restoring the familiar baseline. This explains why people can achieve something and still not hold it. The results arrived, but the identity that would sustain it has not stabilized yet. So eventually life drifts back towards what feels normal. Now that's not failure. That is structure, and once you understand structure, change becomes possible. The turning point comes when you stop asking, why is this happening? And start asking, what pattern is revealing here? That shift completely changes everything, because now results become feedback, not punishment. And feedback is incredibly useful, because if something is patterned, it can be changed. And if something is structured, it can be restructured. And that is where we're going in this series. Because in the next video, I want to show you something extremely important. The hidden mechanism behind these patterns, and why the nervous system and emotional familiarity actually play such a powerful role in shaping your life. And once you understand that, so many things begin to make sense. So if this video resonated with you in any way at all, I'd like you to subscribe to the channel. And if this helped, leave a comment and write "not random," because that realization alone can be the beginning of real change for you. And as always, I want to thank you for being here. This is John Williams, reminding you that your vision, your beliefs, and your emotions are creating your future right now. Choose wisely, live abundantly, keep dreaming big, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.
Yep. How are you on working? Even if you're like,